This panel is focusing on workforce issues, upskilling workers to meet the challenges of AI, which many of us think will be considerable. My name is Harry Holzer. I'm a labor economist here at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown. And in my youth, which was a while ago, I was chief economist of the U.S. Department of Labor. And we have a terrific panel here that are going to think about and speak about the various workforce issues involved here. Why don't I very briefly introduce them now, then each of them will make a few minutes worth of opening comments, and then we'll try to get a conversation going. So to my immediate left, we have Chike Agu. Chike is now a labor and workforce global luminary at Accenture, and he was the former chief innovation officer at the Department of Labor. Next, we have Jennifer Stanford, who is the senior manager for international trade and energy and environmental policy at Cisco Systems. To Jennifer's left, we have Alejandra Montoya Boyer, who's the director of the Center for Civil Rights and Technology at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. And then lastly, to Alejandra's left, we have Scott Jensen, who's the director of workforce strategy for CHIPS at the U.S. Department of Commerce right now. So I think we're going to go in that order, and I'm going to start with Chike and just move down and take 2 or 3 minutes just to put a few of your thoughts on the table for further discussion.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much to the panelists and to Georgetown and to Accenture for hosting this. And there's a lot to be said, I think, that I could say, but I think what I generally talk about when I think about AI and workforce is I think we need a bit of a paradigm shift, and I'll talk about what I mean by that. When I was in the private sector, we used to talk a lot about doing more with less, and usually the more meant more revenue, more impact with less people and resources. I think, and if we're not careful, we will have the same conversation about AI. How do we use AI to do, again, marginally more revenue with less people? I think the paradigm we want to move to is what I call doing a lot more with a lot more. Basically, how do we get a lot more revenue, a lot more impact with a second a lot more, which is this combination of people and AI. That is actually where I think not just the most equitable outcome is, but frankly the one that's going to be most successful for businesses, for governments, for organizations. And so I think what we are at the beginning of is thinking about how do AI and people come together in ways that benefit everyone. You've heard some cases here. How do we, frankly, automate the routine, the low cognitive, not to get rid of the worker, but to free up more of their mind so that they can do things that are far more valuable and far more things that people should actually be doing. And so I think that is the challenge right now. I think one other thing that I'll say here is there is a bit of a conversation about, do I train people to use AI, or do I, frankly, have them do things that the AI can't do? And the answer is yes. The answer is that, frankly, we need to train people to use AI, because AI in a year is going to be like Microsoft Office. It's going to be like Google. You would not hire someone who could not use Microsoft Office, who could not use Google Search. These tools will be like that if they are not already. But then also we have to make sure that workers, particularly as we're thinking about workforce development, can do the things that only people can do. Because in the end, that's the long term, that's going to make them economically indispensable. So how do we do a lot more with a lot more? And then how do we teach people to use the AI? And how do we teach or double down on the things that only the people can do?
Good, thank you. Jennifer.
Hi, I'm Jen Sanford. I'm the Senior Director for International Trade and Workforce Policy at Cisco. Cisco is a $53 billion company with 90,400 employees all around the world. And we have the pleasure of leading a consortium of companies and advisors that are examining the impact of AI on the technology workforce, and then offering recommendations for training for the workforce as a result of AI adoption. We recently issued a report in January of this year It's on the Cisco website, but if you Google the AI-enabled ICT consortium, you will find the report that examines 47 job roles, the most in-demand job roles, according to Indeed. And what we found as we broke down each job role into tasks as a group, we found that 92% of these job roles would be impacted either moderately or to a significant degree by the adoption of AI. And that presents an opportunity and a challenge, which we completely recognize in the sense that the group is looking to, moving forward, build an AI skills taxonomy similar to a skills taxonomy that was developed for the cyber workforce. We're looking to create a playbook on AI training so that the companies that are part of this consortium, and forgive me, let me mention who they are Accenture, Eightfold, Google, Microsoft, Intel, Indeed, SAP, and Cisco. And Google. Did I not mention Google?
Yeah.
I did mention Google. Okay, great. Good. So the 9 companies are working together, and we're advised by the AFL-CIO, the Communication Workers of America, Chain 5, the European Vocational Training Association, the Khan Academy, as well as the SME United, which is a small business association in Europe. So happy to take questions and delve further into workforce and AI and what we found in the tech sector.
Good, thank you. Alejandra.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alejandra Montoya Boyer, she, her, AI pronouns, and I'm the Senior Director for the Center on Civil Rights and Technology at the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights. For folks that don't know, the Leadership Conference is the oldest and largest civil rights coalition. We represent over 240 civil and human rights organizations across the country, representing every type of community across race, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and we engage in policy advocacy, public education, and research across a plethora of issues. And we created the Center for Civil Rights and Technology last year, where we celebrated our 1-year birthday last month. And we're really trying to make sure that as new technologies and emerging technologies are developed and deployed, they're doing so, making sure that civil rights are being protected, that technology is being developed and deployed equitably without harm to our most marginalized communities, and really making sure that as we roll out these technologies, particularly as we talk about the workforce impact, that marginalized communities are not only engaged in the process and the development and deployment of the technology, they're centered in the way that the technology is created, and they're at the heart of the workforce conversation. So we do that through a number of ways. We engage in conversations directly with policymakers to make sure that technology regulation includes civil rights protections. We know that a lot of these technologies have discriminatory and biased implications, whether that's intentional or not, and have a disparate impact on particularly communities of color and particularly Black and Indigenous communities. So we're working to make sure that that's being regulated through the federal government, with different states. We also work directly with companies like many of the ones that Jennifer named, Google, Microsoft, Indeed, Intel, a number of different companies, to make sure that they are engaging in the conversation around equitable development and deployment of these technologies. And when it comes to the workforce conversation, we're really kind of centering to make sure that the conversation, we break the conversation around workforce and jobs into 2 pieces. There is the workers themselves that are engaged in the technology ecosystem, making sure that they have equitable quality jobs, that they have access to the education resources and reskilling lifelong learning that it takes to maintain those jobs. And that they're paid equitably within the workforce that they have. There's also another subset of work that we do that ensures that the technology itself is not harming workers. So we know that, as I mentioned, these technologies have built-in biases and discriminatory processes. We're making sure that we're hoping to make sure that these technologies don't make it so that folks of color, women, queer folks aren't filtered out of job prospects or job applications when applying for jobs in the technology. We also know that AI is having an impact on the quality of jobs. And so companies are using AI systems to surveil their workers that can have discriminatory and harmful impacts on workers. So we're working with other civil rights leaders and partners, unions, many of which Jennifer also mentioned, to make sure that we're creating the proper worker protections in the rollout of these technologies. I said a lot of somewhat negative things about the technology, so I also want to emphasize that we also work to make sure that the technology is able to benefit communities of color and other marginalized folks. We know that there's a massive amount of economic opportunity to make sure that not just workers, but all communities are able to benefit from the use of artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies. So we also want to create a technological ecosystem that ensures that all communities are able to thrive from that growth.
Good, thank you. And Scott.
Well, I think I'm going to, hello everyone, nice to see all of you, and thanks for having us here. I'd like to I'd approach this topic a little bit more tactically, because that's my day job. I'm in charge of workforce strategy for the CHIPS and Science Act. And two things AI has already changed and will continue to change, and none of us are prepared for it. And it isn't so much about the quality of work and what's going to happen. It's just the infrastructure to allow for artificial intelligence to really work. So, we don't have enough chips. I don't know if you've heard that, but I think my boss has done a pretty good job of making that case, and it's true. And also, we don't have enough data centers once we have those chips, and we don't have enough workers for either. So those two facts, how many workers we need for data centers, how many workers we need manufacturing semiconductors themselves, we have to change the way we're going to do things. AI will be part of that. So as we're sort of getting ready to train workers, we're going to have to, at the same time, prepare for a new workplace. And it's quite difficult. And I think that how we're approaching it, and I think this is the right thing to do, and Harry, I think you'll agree, demand-driven workforce development has to really be part of the equation. Companies do not know how to integrate AI into their operations just yet. And this is the part, Professor Holzer, every single chips company is approaching this through an apprenticeship lens. Every single one. We want to do an apprenticeship program. And how do we in the United States, when we cannot centrally plan? You can't go to Arizona and start testing third graders and figure out who shows promise to be in a certain job when they graduate from the middle school. We have to have a more dynamic system than that, and that's going to rely on using data well to find out what skills people have, what skills they lack, what skills are actually necessary to do a job as opposed to merely a college degree, and use AI and use technology for the benefit of those workers to connect them to those opportunities. And I think we're seeing really innovative things happening around the country in that context. So I think AI is at the beginning, and it's at the end, and it's even before the beginning. So look forward to answering some questions and shedding a little bit more light on what's happening right now.
Good, thank you. So you each spoke from a somewhat different perspective, bringing a somewhat different lens, which is great. So I'm going to try to put some packages of issues on the table so each of you can approach the package from each of your respective lenses. And I'm going to start just with this basic issue. All of you alluded to the fact that, as with any kind of automation, some people will likely be helped, some hurt. Some people's tasks, specific tasks, will be replaced or substituted for. But on the other hand, other workers, and maybe those same people, will find their skills augmented. You know, and economists have this thing you learn in principles of economics, complements versus substitutes. And any kind of automation substitutes for some workers or for some of their skills and complements other. It's much, much better to be a complement than a substitute. And the whole idea of workforce policy would be to turn substitutes into complements. The people that are facing the axe, perhaps, into complements for whom AI will augment their skills and rather than be replaced by. So let me just put a few specific questions about that on the table. Number one, who are the workers that face the greatest risks of displacement? Not just from, say, a demographic view that Alejandro mentioned, but say more from an occupational point of view. Secondly, what kinds of skills should we be hoping to teach them? And Chika, you mentioned the basic dichotomy. Do we want to teach them to use AI or to do other things? And you said probably both, some mix both, which makes sense, but how do you organize that? And then maybe we'll move to a policy frame. And both Alejandro and Scott really focused on policy. Do we have the right policy tools in place? Scott, you mentioned apprenticeship. Many employers might speak positively of apprenticeship, but don't know how to do it. The take-up rates are very low. What kinds of policies or practices would we need to move that ball down the road? But let's start first with who faces possible displacement, who's going to be a substitute versus a complement, and maybe start with Chika and just move down, and then maybe we'll get you guys interacting with each other, responding to each other, et cetera.
And thank you for putting some bit of a historical context. I think this is where AI is a little different than maybe other historical automating technologies. I think in the past, if you were someone who did tasks that were routine or who did tasks that required your strength, you are more likely to be automated. It's a little different now in the sense of right now, if you were to go to any BLS report and you were to look at the need and demand for welders through the roof. I'm from the state of Maryland. We are going to start to rebuild the Key Bridge, which collapsed last year, hopefully Q1. We do not have enough welders, machinists, and we would pay them 6 figures to help us rebuild that bridge. AI cannot do that job. In fact, actually, we've seen AI and things powered by AI not good at mimicking fine motor function and gross motor function that humans do. And then on the other side, we've not seen AI at this point yet able to do what many of you do, write, think, lead, things like that. What generative AI is actually very good at is reading and writing. This is new. So for example, paralegals, folks who do document review who are in the legal profession. This is for the first time, I think, when we've seen automation, where professions like that have actually been at risk. That is a new paradigm, I think, for many, and I think there's even folks who are kind of at the beginning stages of computer programming are now, ChatGPT can do some of what I do. So I think that's a new paradigm that we need to think about and consider. I think the other thing that I'll say is, what I think is still true is there's always been this choice between, do I tell my kid to study computer science or do I tell my kid to study philosophy? And I think economically, and you're more the economist than I am, but it's generally the people who have that combination of skills who are generally most economically indispensable. And I think that is still true. I think that mix of kind of non-cognitive skills along with technical skills is actually what is going to keep someone being successful and needed within the economy. So I think what's different now is that you have different people who are at risk that have historically been at risk in past. And then secondly, what I think is still true is having that combination of technical skill plus, call it, non-cognitive skill, are the ones who are still going to persist and excel in the economy.
And I think what's interesting is that I think you're right that the people now facing the potential substitution are higher up the education ladder than before. And in fact, people below them might be augmented in their skills rather than substituted for. On the other hand, the ability of those college grads to adapt might still be greater as it's been in the past. The ability to figure this out, to get some course of study at a community college or online or something like that, so which can still make who benefits and who doesn't benefit an interesting possibility. But Jennifer, let's hear your thoughts on this.
Sure. So the report that the 9 companies and 7 advisors released in July actually had a fair amount of detail in terms of which job categories or job families would see the greatest amount of change. And those were design and user experience type of tech jobs, testing and quality assurance jobs, and interestingly, business and management. Software development had a very high impact, but it was moderate impact. It wasn't high impact. These 3 that I mentioned initially were high impact of AI on those job families. And as a result, we looked at the types of skills that people may want to, and this would be for incumbent workers or students that are looking to come into the tech sector and aren't quite sure where to navigate. What are some of the foundational skills that are necessary to thrive in an AI era? And AI literacy and ethics, very, very important, and I would say ethics in particular, because of the issues mentioned earlier. Data fundamentals was another area, just the fundamentals of data and how it's created, how it's stored, how it's processed, how it's sent around. One thing I would add to your list of predicates to we need chips and we need data centers, we need broadband. Because that data can't get anywhere without broadband. Yeah, no, I just putting in a plug for the BEAD program, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, over at the Department of Commerce.
And Jennifer, is your study, what's the time frame? Next decade, next 2 or 3 decades?
It's the next 3 to 5 years.
Oh, that's a very short run.
Right,
Okay.
because we know that, and we're going to keep the report updated annually, because this is going to evolve very quickly. AI, as was mentioned before, could frankly take over some roles. And one of the participants in the consortium said to me early on, which I thought was an interesting observation, she said, AI may not necessarily take your job, but someone who knows how to use AI may take your job. And so that really, really lends itself to developing AI literacy, prompt engineering, those types of fundamental.
But also, and I was going to put this off until later, the view that what makes sense to study in the next 3 to 5 years might be quite different from a decade beyond that or 2. And for young people who have a long horizon they're looking at, maybe we should teach them to think about that as well.
Well, also, and the Khan Academy raises this frequently, are the so-called soft skills or foundational skills, communications, collaboration. Those are how to work in a team. Those are all important skills. You can supplement your competitiveness as a worker, frankly, if you adopt and hone your skills in those areas as well.
Those have been listed as what people call 21st century skills for a while now, and it sounds even more true today.
Even more important in an AI era, yes.
Alejandra.
Yeah, I think we're talking about a couple of different things here that I want to put in from, or like my own perspectives and the work that I do at the Leadership Conference and where we're coming from. I think first off, to the point about like what types of jobs AI can augment or potentially replace. When we're talking about AI is good at reading and writing and not good at fine motor skills, that presents a huge challenge around, like, I don't know about you all, but like, I would rather read and write than, do laundry or do dishes. And the job quality and the types of jobs that we're able to create with the way that artificial intelligence is working right now, at least, and where its skills are best, is presenting a huge challenge for the types of jobs that are going to exist, particularly for low-income, low-wage, or low to middle income, low to middle wage, and low to middle skill jobs. And so when we're having a conversation about what are the things that AI will augment or replace, we have to also have a conversation about broader worker protections, the economic systems we're working in right now, and especially in the policy conversation when we're talking about job quality, as I was talking about. So, that means minimum wage increases. That means, the benefits packages people get. That also means what types of, quality of your job. Are you happy in your work? Are you able to thrive? Do you see yourself having a career ladder? And those conversations, when we add the AI piece, get a lot more difficult because 10 years ago, when I moved to DC, I was working on Computer Science for All. I was on Capitol Hill, and that was like the big push. I remember drafting all kinds of legislation, and there was this whole conversation about how do we make sure, particularly for women and girls and for people of color, how do we make sure that folks have access to quality computer science education, coding programs. There was a broad conversation about what that looked like. As Jennifer's pointing out, a lot of those jobs are drastically shifting, if not being potentially replaced by machine learning and AI. And so a part of this conversation is making sure that we're having policy discussions that are iterative, that are responsive, and recognizing that this goes beyond an education policy, this goes beyond tech policy, AI specific. We're talking about broader economic systems. And so I just want to emphasize that, like, for minimum wage workers, many of whom are at risk, not as many as we thought in initial conversations because of a lot of what's been pointed out, the opportunities for quality, high-paying, or even just like I can survive my life paying jobs are diminishing. And that's true for a number of reasons, not just AI, but AI is exacerbating those challenges. So I think that we need to be having conversations, especially when we're talking about policy. Are we able to provide resources to education institutions like HBCUs, tribal colleges, minority-serving institutions that can get engaged and involved in the research and development that we need, in the education and training and resources that we need? But also, how are we creating kind of iterative cycles that if and when AI and machine learning shifts even further in 5 to 10 years, which it probably will, are we readapting our policymaking to respond to the needs of workers and communities at that stage? So I think that, particularly when we're talking about the education and reskilling piece, we really have to think about it in pretty short increments because I think it's going to continue to drastically shift. The broadband question is also really critical. I've sat in many rooms just like this having conversations around how do we make sure that marginalized folks have access to AI literacy, education, resources, and there's always someone, and folks are raising their hands like, I live on the Navajo Nation and I don't even have broadband access. How am I able to get, and it's not just the Navajo Nation, it's all across the country, rural, urban, tribal communities that are have either poor or no access to broadband, or it's too expensive. So I think some of these conversations, or what we can't do is have the conversation in a vacuum. And so we're responding to a lot of different pieces. And so I want to emphasize kind of for all communities to be able to benefit and thrive in this shifting dynamic, we really have to think about this like broad spectrum of issues going beyond just the like smaller puzzle piece that is AI and look at all of these broader other pieces in the ecosystem.
Well, Alejandra, you've put to me what a scarily long list of issues on that. And I, at the current moment, forgive me for having a little bit of doubt about the competence of the federal government to deal with any of those, much less all of them, maybe state and local. We'll come back to that. Scott, you want to put a few issues? And then I'm going to go back and ask you guys specifically about policy or policy changes?
Sure. I would kind of cast it in a policy frame just right out of the gate, which is there is a picture that will not work about how you educate and train and give people opportunities. It is not going to be some expert knows what to do and trains everybody to do it. It is going to be an expert works with those who are changing the workplace, those who are doing the work, and there's a give and take. And this is kind of what I meant by demand driven. There really needs to be a different paradigm. And I was a philosophy professor, so I'm a little bit upset about the ranking. I'm teasing.
You might be the least replaceable then out of any of us.
That's right. That's right. But it's a different kind. It's a practical engagement that really needs to happen, because if we don't do that, we're not going to give people the opportunities that their talents and inclinations deserve. And that's really what we're going to need to get to when people are augmented by AI, rather than, I went to such and so university, and which we know bias infects that.
So let me ask then about, you've all laid out some things that need to happen, and people who might face better or more adverse challenges. Are our institutions, higher ed institutions, secondary school, workforce institutions, and policies up to the task? And if not, where? Do we need to be tweaking Title IV and the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, or doing something much more fundamental about getting these institutions and policies ready? Do we need policies that barely exist right now, like lifelong learning accounts for workers, that if things are going to change over and over again every 3 to 5 years, maybe there's some way to really make this idea of lifelong learning a possibility? Or trade adjustment assistance turned into automation adjustment assistance, something bigger. But talking about both the institutions and the policies, and where do you think, and we can talk about positives as well, because we know that AI is going to make the training better and more accessible remotely, which is a big plus, I think. But maybe you can think about the existing institutions and policies, and GK, you look a little worried about this.
No,
but just whichever piece of that you want to address.
I'm happy to run my mouth for a bit while people come up with far better thoughts than I will say. I think, let's say one fact, and then let's talk about the two sides of this, which I think Alejandra really brought forth to us, which is one thing we're not talking about at the same time as the AI thing is we are facing, likely for the next 50 years, depending on how you look at the data, again, and you're more the economist than I am, a stagnant or slightly shrinking workforce. In Maryland, where I am from, there are 2 jobs open for every 1 person looking. And if you were to take that by certain sectors, that number goes up by a lot. If the labor force participation rate was 100%, I cannot tell you that we could fill every job that's open now and will be open in the future. So as we think about AI, the question is, okay, we have to maximize every person that we have. We just have to. But then also, even by doing that, we still don't hit all the economic kind of benchmarks that we want to. So how does AI come in and help us do that? That is the ideal. That is, I think, the best future, where we maximize every single person that we have in the country, and AI helps us kind of figure out how we even help them maximize more of themselves. The point that Alejandra brought up is a real one, which is this is not simply, and I used to work for Julia Su, and she used to say this all the time, this conversation cannot just be, how do we fix workers? That's, even if you quote unquote fix workers, which is already a flawed paradigm, you don't actually get to where you want to go. There's a supply and demand issue. So I'd say 2 buckets of issues that I would think about. One, on the assistance side for workers, I spent my 2.5 years in government working on unemployment insurance. And just to give you a sense of the scale of unemployment insurance during the pandemic, from May 2020 to May of 2021, we gave $850 billion to 1/3 of the American workforce. Just the largest, probably the largest income transfer programs in the history of the species. And we still have a lot of problems. I would, when you dive into it, it's because, as you well know, and many people on the stage know, there's unemployment insurance, and there was pandemic unemployment assistance, and there's trade adjustment assistance, and we have 80 million ways for people to get money that they are owed. Making that far simpler, far clearer, and it's just, if you are economically dislocated or want to better yourself, here's the one place and set of resources that you can go to help invest in yourself. That becoming one thing that's easy for an American to understand would help a lot of people who are particularly in economically tough circumstances. One of my old colleagues, Michelle Evermore, she used to say, the day someone files for unemployment is the worst day of their lives. And that's the day that we ask them to navigate this very complicated system to better themselves, which doesn't help anybody. The other thing that I would say is on the demand side, which is a lot of companies do things that are self-defeating in terms of they screen out talent that could work at their company because they look for degrees that actually don't matter. Not that all degrees don't matter, but some actually don't matter. Then you require them for someone to apply for your job, and you don't recruit in all the communities that you could. You think of doing another job fair in Harvard Yard is going to get you the workers that you need. No, you've hired those people already. You're going to have to go to different places, and so I think incentives to do more of the type of training that Scott is talking about is really important. One, maybe a 2A I'll add to that is, when I talk to a lot of companies who want to do apprenticeship, there's the technical challenge of, I don't know how to do this. There's another challenge which doesn't get said enough, but is actually as important, which is an apprenticeship, by definition, is someone, while they're training, works for me and I pay them. But they're not producing me any economic benefit, or not total economic benefit, until they exit the apprenticeship, because they don't know enough. So I eat that cost while they are training. Some businesses that are very big can just take it out of their profit margin, but there are a lot of businesses that are very thin margin who can't. They say, hey, I want to do this, but I don't know how I do this and also pay my bills. We don't have a system of finance to help businesses do that in this country. In other countries, like in the UK and Germany and Switzerland, people say they're different countries, but they're not that different. They have figured some variant of this out. How do you support a business who is investing in their workers so that they can reap the benefit later, and we all reap the benefit? So I'd say for me, it's how do you make the system of assistance for workers far simpler and also more robust? But then for companies, how do you incentivize them to go to communities that they normally don't recruit from? And then also, how do you fill the finance gap for them, particularly for small and medium-sized businesses who generally aren't that flush with cash to make that happen?
There are interesting new models, people call it talent finance, where either a public sector entity or a nonprofit might put money up front to finance them and then get some piece of it returned when the worker is experiencing the higher productivity. So, there's models like that too.
And the one thing I'll say there is, and having a model like that where the risk is not on the back of the worker, is, I think, really important. This is a thing that has been talked about a lot, but right now, and I'll just use one analogy. If I'm a construction company and I want to buy a bulldozer, I don't buy that with cash, I buy it with debt. But if I go and I'm going to train this person to use the bulldozer, there's no system for me to invest in that person, which makes no actual sense. But that's the system that we have here in the States, and it frustrates what a lot of businesses, big and small, are trying to do to fill that. So sorry for going on too long.
We have federal loans for a piece of that in higher
Yes.
ed, but not
But
more
nothing
broadly outside of that.
yeah.
I think that goes to your question about, do we tweak WIOA? And I think the answer is those systems are not working like they should. That doesn't mean we get rid of all of it and start anew, but we do have a lot of work to do. And I think, for example, training, and this is kind of to your bulldozer point, and this is what we're doing at the CHIPS Act. If you want the semiconductor industry to come to the United States, you have to give money for workforce development, and that money has to be very flexible and able to hit the right incentive notes for all of the network that you absolutely need regionally. Community colleges, nonprofits, apprenticeship programs, to help make that transition happen. So, how exactly that's done in every case, I think, the CHIPS Act and other things that the Labor Department's done over the years that are demand-driven, that are flexible, that have a pilot-to-scale sort of mentality. We need to pay close attention to those. And then we need to study them. I have spent the last year fighting with my colleagues at the Commerce Department about data. We need really granular data because we need to know what works and what doesn't work in these programs we're funding, because we want to be able to say, hey, look, we came upon something. Some folks tried something out, and we really know what this is and why it works and how it might be replicated. So those changes need to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in addition to the resources from the federal government through CHIPS, through all of the different ways that we put together workforce development packages that are specific to, in this case, semiconductor industry, but other emerging technologies, I think we also have to hold our companies accountable. There's a lot of power that the tech companies have in terms of the resources and infrastructures they build in their local communities through community benefits agreements, through, when a tech company invests in its local industries and communities, they're able to engage starting from, K through 12 into higher education systems to who are the workers that they need. And if you're coming to Palo Alto, if you're coming to Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I'm from, if you're going to Detroit, wherever, those companies can reinvest some of the billions of dollars that they have back into an infrastructure to support their own workforce.
Jennifer, do you want to get into this?
Sure. So as one of the big companies present, I will say that with 90,000 employees, so not insignificant, we spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about our employees and thinking about upskilling, reskilling our employees. We actually provide 10% of a person's time for development so that people can stay current in their skills development.
Jennifer, is that on an ongoing basis?
On an ongoing basis. I've been with the company 20 years, and we have resources that we provide to our employees to upskill and reskill, technically, but also in the areas I was mentioning earlier, like collaboration and creativity and critical thinking and communication skills, in addition to all the tech-specific, tech-heavy types of trainings that you might imagine a tech company would have. But I think that companies you're talking about grants or subsidies, if you will. Why not make it a tax break, for example, for companies to invest in workforce training, right? We have tax breaks for R&D. We don't have tax breaks for the money that we use toward training. And that might be a good use of taxpayer dollars.
Well, it's a tool, right?
It's a tool,
It's
right?
a tool, and
We talk about trade adjustment assistance. I'm a trade policy person by training. And many people talk about the limitations of trade adjustment assistance, but trade adjustment assistance did help a group of workers, some workers, with unemployment insurance, or with wage insurance, with unemployment benefits, with training dollars, with access to a COBRA policy for health care. So there were some really good elements to the TAA program that I think could be drawn from.
And recent research on that program is actually much more positive than
And
it had been in the past, and raises the question of should we then extend it to things beyond trade, like
And
automation.
I know this is a very political topic because trade adjustment assistance is seen by many Republicans, if you will, as a big government type of program, and by many Democrats as essential to the passage of a trade agreement when it's brought back to the United States, because there will be more import competition for American workers. It just strikes me that at this AI transition, there's going to be a lot of turbulence, and people are going to need support. So we should be looking at things, in my opinion, like TAA. We should be looking at tax breaks for companies. We should be looking at incentivizing community colleges, universities to adapt their curriculum so that students can learn how to use AI in their studies responsibly, right? So how do you ethically represent the fact that you used AI for a research paper? I have a daughter in high school. She is not permitted to use AI in high school, which I appreciate to a certain degree. But the fact is, when she's out in the workforce, she'll have AI at her disposal. And so why not teach her how to use it responsibly?
We're having those same conversations here at Georgetown and 2- and 4-year institutions all over the country about. So a lot of this conversation is often along the lines of, well, companies are going to make these decisions, and then we got to help people adapt, and maybe we give some tax breaks to the company to encourage more of that adaptation. But there's another line of thought that says, okay, companies, there will be market forces that will drive some of these company decisions, but that in fact is not a level playing field necessarily. And I'll throw out a couple of ways in which it's not. Number one, a lot of people think the tax code right now favors new capital investment over retraining and labor, and that is going to tilt the playing field towards replacement, not. So maybe on top of your subsidy for the training or tax credit for the training, maybe we want to have a tax on worker displacement. And that's not a crazy idea because the unemployment insurance system already does a version of that, right? The companies that lay off a lot of workers, something called experience rating, do actually pay a higher tax break. It's just that it's not higher when the layoffs are permanent rather than temporary, which I think are much more costly than it should be. But maybe we should be more proactive. And of course, there's also studies showing that in countries or firms where workers have some institutionalized voice, like a labor union, that the implementation is different and that the companies have to take the worker well-being into account in a way that now they don't. Should we be thinking more about, and so it builds on your idea, Jennifer, of how do we incentivize the companies to do this, to implement the AI in a more worker-friendly way, in a way that augments more people and substitutes less? Do we even know how to do that? Maybe we should be doing that for the developers of the AI before it even gets to that. And do we have any idea of how to do that?
Yeah, I think we need to start even further. And we do a lot of work directly with companies to talk through the process, before it even gets to the deployment stage. Within the investment, gestation, and development stages, we need to be having assessments around, should this AI even be made yet? Is this tool, is this system, whatever it is it ethical? Is it affordable? Is it sustainable? There are a lot of challenges in terms of how we assess the tools. I have a very particularly biased, probably, view on when and how we create the tools, but some types of assessments that include a workforce analysis that really show what are the potential jobs that this would either augment or displace. Is it worth it? Because we're still talking about really flawed technology. The other thing we need to be thinking about is these tools, much like humans, are deeply flawed, and so is it even proper for them to be rolled out when they are? So that we're starting with the assessment of, do we want to make this tool? And we make that decision by understanding its workforce implications, its financial implications. These are companies, they're gonna wanna make money. And we've actually been having a lot of conversations directly with some of the venture capitalists and investors that invest in these technologies to really understand that before it even gets to the development stage, we need to be having these conversations. So I think before we even get it to the conversation, and then there's like you were talking about, in the incentivizing companies, I think it needs to go beyond that. We're talking about, we've been having conversations with policymakers that might not continue, we'll see, around guaranteed income or ways to ensure for workers that are displaced by AI, are there ways to ensure an unemployment insurance benefits a tax break. There are many different ways that we could set this up. But those conversations need to be happening long before we're in the deployment stage. And then with development, we also need to be assessing and reassessing. The assessment process on these tools is very iterative. That really needs to look at what types of harm, who is it impacting, what are the harms. There's legislation that we've been engaged in that would be able to stop or at least roll back
So you're talking
AI.
about really a robust research agenda,
Yes.
which Scott also alluded to earlier when he talked about data. But Jennifer or Chike, do you want to also get into this, or Jennifer and then Chike?
Yeah, there were a couple of points I wanted to make that had come up in the context of the work of the consortium. A was the notion of a family-sustaining job, that the jobs that we are trying to create here should be family-sustaining. Two, we should take into account things like wraparound services, transportation support, even housing support to a certain degree, childcare, so that people can actually take the time to retrain. And as I said, some businesses, including our own, provide their workers with time to retrain. All of those things, I think, are really vital. And in terms of, apprenticeships and WIOA and sort of the workforce policy world, I will say that the apprenticeship program, the national apprenticeship program that's overseen by the Department of Labor, can be very inflexible, in which case it's very difficult to get your program accredited or, approved by the Department of Labor. So that's why many companies just set up their own apprenticeship programs.
Unregistered as opposed to registered.
Unregistered.
Yes, to get around it.
And it's something, we need to look at the gaps there and why are companies not taking up these apprenticeship programs so that we can be more like Europe with its vocational training and things like that.
But there's a lot of institutional support starting in the high schools in many countries. That's just a whole different approach. Chike and then Scott, you want to say anything on this?
I think, so there's the question of, does, frankly, giving the worker more power in the implementation of AI, is that the right thing to do? I would say generally yes, but I would say it's something more foundational, which is looking at the research, and just thinking about my contextual experience with companies. When workers are involved, you get better implementation. Just plain and simple. Because generally you are applying AI to novel contexts that has not been applied to before. So basically getting a sense of, from workers, tell me how this is working. It leads you to better outcomes. The AFL-CIO Tech Institute and Carnegie Mellon have actually engaged in a ton of amazing work in the Pittsburgh area around these same types of things. If you want to use an analogy, back in the day, you think about kind of manufacturing plants, and they would have these competitions where line crews they would say, let's have a competition to see who can shave 2 minutes off cycle time. Figure it out. And you'd have these great competitions where they figure out how to change processes and basically reduce cycle time, which makes the plant more efficient. But they did not impose a thing. They said, let me ask the people who do the job every day how to actually do the thing. And I think we're going to need more of that here. I'm also biased. Kevin Gallagher was walking somewhere around here. Our departments came together when we were in the Biden administration to come up with good jobs principles. And one of those things was about giving workers more of a voice in their day-to-day job, but also in broader governance. The last thing I'll say is that there's the world that I want, and then there's the world that we live in, which is you asked the question of do we do more foundational things or do we work with what we have? And the answer is, of course, you do both. Realistically, in the near term, I think working with the laws that we have, WIOA being one, but there are also a number of others that exist, is also really helpful. And I would also say it's not just at the federal level. At state level, local levels, there are amazing states and localities who are doing things that, in the state of Maryland, we have a requirement now in law that the majority of high school students will have a work-based learning experience before they graduate high school. we may be one of the first in the country, maybe the first to do that.
have to see.
Well, we will have to see, but it's hard for me to see that be happening on the federal level for a little while. And so I think let's figure out the kind of laboratories of democracy approach that I think can make some of this work.
You know, it's an interesting argument you make because there are a lot of economists, and I remember hearing these debates who would say, if it's really so good for firms that their employees be more productive, they'd be doing it already, that the market already, and the fact that they're not doing it. There's another point of view, say, no, employers have a lot of blinders on and strong biases before they come in, and in fact, you might need a nudge or a push from the public sector to get them to do more of that.
Yeah. I think that's right. And as I was listening to you talk, when we're talking about inclusionary hiring, good jobs, and keeping workers and training workers, which I'm sure you guys are doing, it sounds like nice stuff. Oh, isn't that nice? Like we have business over here, and then we want to be nice too. I think that's wrong. I think that we do need some incentives to nudge people to say, no, you're not going to get financed if you can't explain to me where you're going to get the workers that are going to execute on this business model.
To nudge the employers.
To nudge employers. We, Wall Street, think that you will fail if you don't have something in place that gives us confidence. We are doing that in the CHIPS Act, and I can't tell you how many of my colleagues from Wall Street have said, well, they're going to find workers. You know, I don't think really what you guys are doing in workforce is really that important.
That's another strong bias.
Yeah, and you know, and these are, I would call friends of mine now, who I like, and you know, I would say obnoxious things to them, like, yeah, you don't know what you're talking about. That's why you've led our country into ruin. You know, and I don't think that's true, but you know, kid with them about it. But I think there is a bias, and there needs to be a nudge to better quantify the effect of a really well-talented workforce where you are finding people. For whoever has the talent, that's who you need in a job, particularly if you're going to have AI augmenting people's natural talent. So,
And just to put a quick point on that, there are studies that show that the increased use of generative AI will have a $43 billion exacerbation of the racial wealth gap every year. So we're talking about, you know, billions of dollars that are not being put back into our economy if we don't solve some of these problems.
Yeah, and there are some projections that the owners of the automation not even are really going to reap great benefits because the automation will be so much more powerful, and that should implement or impact our thinking as well. And I want to push back a little bit against Jennifer, something you said.
Yes.
When you said these should all be family-sustaining jobs. I would push back against that because, you know, and that might be realistic for a lot of the companies, the high-end, large, very profitable companies. I would not want any kind of regulation saying if you're not generating a job that pays, I don't know, $40,000 or anything like that, we're not going to help you, or you're not. I mean, there are increments at the low end that maybe take people from 20 to 25 or 30 that I would, so that's what makes me nervous about.
I wouldn't
about the whole
regulate
good,
it
you know.
either. I don't think that's what I was suggesting.
Okay.
What we examined in the consortium were ICT jobs, technology jobs, which have higher wage rates than the national
start with.
average to start with.
Okay.
And they tend to be family-sustaining jobs. So, pardon me for
It's okay. I'm glad you
perhaps
clarified.
misspeaking, but what I'm referring to is in the tech sector.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm going to throw out one more question, and then we're going to open it up to audience questions. This might be a tall order for, again, given what we see in the functioning of government right now, the polarization, in some places the raw incompetence, to make the right decisions. And if you look at the level of populist anger today, which in response to a lot of forces, but at least partly economic, perhaps partly the digital revolution, if we think these changes are going to be more profound, do we have the confidence in the ability of our political system to respond in a positive manner, along the lines that all four of you have suggested? And if not, how do we perhaps create, because if you don't have competent government and cooperative, it's going to be hard to do any of these things. Or as we see now in the federal sector, every time a different administration comes in, they sweep away everything the previous has done if it's not enshrined in law. But do we have, is there a precondition for government competence to enact the things that all four of you have described, and how do we encourage it? Maybe it's more at the state or local level, because the federal is the most polarized level, but any thoughts on that before we open it up to people?
I think that's right, and I don't think there is great confidence right now, but we need it. The country needs it, and we are going to need to make some changes, and that's going to require some political courage. I think, recently our election was about change and doing exactly the same thing. We know that won't work. It's like the Poseidon Adventure. You know that if you stay put, things aren't going to turn out well. So you need to act. And at the state and local level, I think it's easier to act, frankly, because the pressure from the pressure to solve some of the problems are much more immediate.
Right.
And it's not going to be the federal government gets to be the expert and push everything down. The federal government's going to have to try some things as well.
People need to vote.
And
They need to
express
vote their minds, and to the extent that their government is not working for them, they absolutely need to speak up and vote with their feet. Yeah.
I think two things. When I first came in the Biden administration, there was a phrase that the president would use a lot, which is he talked about things as a whole of government approach. And I think when I used to start giving remarks, I started to tweak that a little bit to say, these are generally whole of society problems. So I think the question is, let's say the federal government actually got its act together and did what we all wanted it to do. That in and of itself wouldn't solve this problem. We actually need the private sector, other levels of government. We don't talk enough about the nonprofit sector. But all these sectors actually need to be firing on all cylinders and also having that courage. The courage is not just political, it is, I would argue it's civic to do a number of these things. And generally, I started my career in local government, then moved to state government, then moved to the federal government. The federal government comes last. It is generally a lagging indicator. There are a few anomalies in time where we find the federal government led, usually times of great national duress. It generally catches on last.
So the incentives are maybe more positive at the local level, where there's demand to solve the immediate problems at the state level than for federal.
And I would go a step further. I think they're even more acute in the private sector, and they're even more acute in the philanthropic sector. I actually would argue I expect to see the folks with capital moving first. And when I say capital, I say the private sector and also the philanthropic sector, even though they're of much different sizes.
It's interesting you say that, because there's an organization that we have worked with marginally as part of this consortium called Social Finance.
I know them well.
You know them well. And they do some very interesting work with companies and nonprofits and other organizations to create basically economic models that bring in philanthropic dollars to a venture that will benefit society, but not necessarily turn a profit per se. And we're collaborating with them actually as part of the consortium, again, to make.
I'm writing a paper for them right now.
Oh, are you?
Sorry. So I'm going to be calling all four of you for ideas, but
Anyway, they do some very innovative
they
work.
do. And
Yeah.
Alejandra, any thoughts before we open it up?
I don't want to end on a negative note, but if the question is, do we have confidence in at least the federal government to respond to what I worry about in this conversation, I'm going to say no. I am deeply concerned about the incoming administration's potential engagement in the AI conversation and the way that they plan to deregulate and use AI in harmful ways. I think there are some bright spots at the local and state level in terms of policy making, but I worry about the most marginalized folks in states where that's not the case. We know the history of civil rights legislation has predominantly come from the federal government because we need to protect everyone. But that being said, I think that, we have a tremendous amount of work in an ecosystem that is geared up and ready to fight where we can and engage in conversations so that when, sorry, I'm trying to not make it a political conversation.
Not
So
a
that,
partisan.
not partisan conversation, exactly. So that we are able to get the guardrails and protections and create a more beneficial AI ecosystem eventually. I think we have a thriving ecosystem of partners that are engaged across all of the institutions that we've talked about: government, private sector, nonprofits, philanthropy.
And
So that's
maybe
positive.
all four of your organizations will generate the knowledge of what works that then can be used to get governments at different levels to play a more
Well, I
positive
think
role.
part of the whole theme of this conference, right, was public-private partnerships.
Right.
And, the consortium that we started actually started by Secretary Raimondo, and in her wisdom.
She starts
She asked our chair and CEO to participate on a US-EU Trade and Technology Council Talent for Growth Task Force. And in that task force, she asked Chuck Robbins, she asked him to lead a work stream on training workers to meet business needs. And in working with all of these organizations, we realized that we also needed to train businesses to meet worker needs. So it goes both ways.
And market forces don't right now incentivize them necessarily, unless if they want to do it to keep the best workers, and that's oftentimes
In order
different.
to retain the best workforce,
Yeah,
absolutely.
that might be, yeah. Let's open it up. There are 2 mics. People can come up and ask questions, and it sounds like you might be up next.
Sure. Hi, Kelly Rogers with Accenture. It's a great conversation, and thank you all for participating and for the great contributions. I want to take it to a very pragmatic, practical level for a moment. And Scott, this is largely directed at you, but welcome other feedback too. So if you think about the CHIPS Act and the part of the act that directs money to manufacturers, we know that there's lots of different programs in the bill, but the piece that gives Intel the $9 billion or Global Foundries or Micron funding to actually create fabs. Over the next 10 years, they're going to have large sums of money, tens of millions of dollars, to direct into the workforce system, right? So to infuse money into the workforce system in states like Arizona, New York, Ohio, New Mexico, and Oregon, among others, Texas. What could those companies be doing, or the ecosystems in those states do, to make sure that as they're spending these millions of dollars, to create fabs, that they're also incorporating the goals that you've all articulated today around Gen AI?
Yeah. I mean, I think at a minimum, they need to realize that we, the country and the broad ecosystem, need their leadership and input on they need to get involved in it. And, the tens of millions of dollars that you are describing is predicated on exactly that. Like, it is not enough to say to a community college, well, I need X many workers. It's what kind, who, what are the jobs that we're really looking for? Does it really take for me, HR person, to hire somebody that comes out of this program? Because we're going to go ask somebody to find them in some circumstance and to make a life change to come and work at Intel, Micron, wherever. So we need to have a job at the end of that pathway's journey. And so it's not enough. You really need to engage deeply. Our money is meant to incentivize that and frankly insist on it. And then show what works and kind of crowd funds to that kind of partnership and that kind of effort so that they can continue. And, to me, policy can change based on once we get some of these ecosystems working to keep fueling them. The CHIPS Act workforce money for, I don't know, let's call it 20 companies is about a little over $300 million, $350 million. I did a back of the envelope calculation. That group of companies is going to need to spend roughly $1.5 billion to keep their workforce trained. A lot of it they'll pay for, a lot of it will be a cost, but we can't kid ourselves that we owe money or the money that comes out of the CHIPS program or whatever is enough. We have to bend some of the spending that's happening that's meant to prepare people to participate in their communities.
And that's
through
why
the
the
economy.
private sector always spends vastly more.
Yeah.
Because there is a market incentive if you want to have skilled employees to do this work. And then maybe if you all figure out the right
Do it like
nudges or whatever,
Yeah.
and maybe they can then spread beyond chips. But
Cisco
Jennifer, do you want to?
created what's called the Cisco Networking Academy, which has invested over $5.5 billion in education to create a curriculum, to donate equipment, and work with high schools, community colleges, and universities all over the world to train people how to become network engineers. And we did that because when we invented the multi-protocol router back in the 1980s, people didn't know how to use it. They didn't know how to hook it up. And so we needed to create engineers, right, who knew how to wire these things and get people on the internet. So yes, in many cases, there's an incentive already built in for companies to train.
But then with the right federal or public nudge to deal with the issues that Alejandra has raised, those concerns,
Absolutely.
to make sure it's done more equitably. Let's bring in another question.
Keisha Raynar, I'm director at Dallas College. Workforce development is what I focus in on, and apprenticeships. So you've kind of touched on all of my different avenues. Let me say you talked about apprenticeships in the Department of Labor. I actually had 2 Department of Labor grants, worth about $26 million. I am currently a part of an NSF Engines grant, so that's why I'm here for tomorrow's conference as well. And I've done quite a bit on the diversity, equity, and inclusion, even though I can't really say that because I'm from Texas. But with that said, we are working our way through all of those things. Well, the thing is that I am one that embraces. That's why I liked what you said, that AI might not take over your job, but a person who knows AI may. And one of the things that I've been trying to get across to not only those who I work with or work for underneath me is how do we get people to incorporate what they do in their lifestyles to understand that AI is going to make it better. Let me say how I can say I used AI in this conference today. Never have used Otter AI before, but I wanted to make sure that I could take notes. So I made sure that I went ahead and downloaded that. I'm a everyday, all day chat GPT lady all the time. But how can we make sure that others can incorporate those types of tools, because it's going to save time, because I don't have time to pay attention to you and also write the notes that I want to make sure that I hear as well.
Thoughts on that from anybody?
I mean, I think the biggest pieces, and I think most folks on the stage have already mentioned this, is around the AI literacy. I worry about a widening gap that we already see in digital equity conversations around who knows how to use these tools. And it is concerning hearing, schools, whether it's K through 12 or higher education, are banning these tools knowing that they're going to be used. And I understand the challenges around plagiarism and other issues that are of concern to educators, and I don't want to minimize that. But I think that making sure or being able to readapt our curriculums and our training systems to respond to AI exists. It's going to continue. It's probably only going to increase in its ability to engage in our lives. And so making sure that we're training everyone to be able to know how to use it safely, be responsible with it. But also, to your point, to make our lives better. The benefits of these types of tools, like previous technologies before us, are to be able to hopefully improve our lives, and offload challenging work that you don't have time for, or all of the different ways. I too use ChatGPT or different tools all day, every day, and I know how to do it, and I have the resources and skills that it takes to be able to do it safely. But I worry about workers and folks, young people and older people as well, that might not have the skills and resources, and we're just going to create another gap in skills and understanding.
So if this conference had been, I don't know if it's being webcast, but if there were sort of a video conferencing type of element to this conference with something like WebEx or Zoom or what have you, there are AI tools within those packages that will create notes for you from the discussion and be very targeted and say, what did Jennifer Sanford say at minute 2.51? And so I think educating people about the fact that these tools exist, because many people may not know that they're embedded within the tool themselves. Microsoft gave a great presentation about its AI tools when we spoke on Capitol Hill about a month ago about AI and workforce training.
Let me just give one more, and this is something I think actually Dallas College could do it. I'm very familiar with your institution. Come up with some path-breaking examples of how this can dramatically improve someone's life, and I'll just name a couple. I think one, I always remember the story from the pandemic, but it was right around when ChatGPT launched, but it was a kind of front-end computer programmer who basically, because he was working remotely, he was able to have basically 3 full-time jobs versus 1. He didn't tell any of the companies, but he basically was able to 3x his productivity just because of the use of the tool. Went from earning, I think, $100,000 to $345,000 and paid for college for his 2 kids. I think about, as well, imagine running, for a panel like this, there'll be a transcript I imagine will come out at some point. One can imagine downloading all these transcripts, putting it all in the ChatGPT and say, please give me a summary of all the salient points of that really easily. But I think an institution like yours has the power to show examples of these in really practical ways to folks who just, not that people aren't smart, they're just busy. They're busy trying to put food on the table, take care of their kids. And I think your institution has the ability to put forward some really lighthouse examples that I think people can learn to use very, very readily. And so that's something I can imagine you could go back and begin to think about on Monday.
I forgot to mention, and just quickly, I think it also poses a great opportunity in terms of the accessibility of information.
Absolutely.
For disabled folks. There's so many ways in which we're able to use AI we use CART services, for example, for our events, and the AI tools that are able to increase its quality, but also to spread information. That's just another quick thing to add.
And there are intelligent tutoring systems being built into a lot of these that make them much more accessible.
Yes.
And so it looks like we have a few more possible questions, but it is after 5. So I think we should stop. We are going to have a reception afterwards, and people can come up, and feel free to come up and ask our panelists and any questions that are on your mind. But this has been a great conversation, so please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.
Hey everybody, just going to make some quick closing remarks. I don't know about you, but I was freezing in here today. So I just wanted to thank you all so much for being here with us today. I'm Michelle Demoy, the Director of the Tech and Public Policy Program here in the McCourt School. And I want to express my gratitude for your time, to our expert panelists for their brilliant insights and ideas today, and to our partners, of course, Accenture and the Global Economic Challenges Network, for driving and organizing today's event. I think what I thought of today, and I can tend to be sort of a visual person, was AI as a tsunami, right? We've seen it building on the horizon for years, and I feel Gen AI pushed it right to the edge, right? That market went right to the edge of the shoreline, but it hasn't broken yet. It's just sort of there, where it's almost a mirage. You can see it, but it hasn't quite broken. And I think today's discussion painted a picture of what the rollout of AI looks like on a federal, city, state, and industry levels, and what the ingredients are for success, right? For sort of pushing AI to break. And I think the ingredients for success echo some of what we heard on both panels. I think there were some connections there. And in short, we aren't ready for the wave to break, is what I heard. There are ingredients that can get us ready, that can get us there. But what I heard is we need some things to happen before we'll be ready for that to happen. So what I heard, the commonalities that I heard between the panels were principles, policy, parts, and people. And some of what was touched on in each of those areas were start with principles. So designing with principles including responsible AI, beneficial, transparent, private, equitable. Those were all principles that both panels touched on. Policy incentives are key. And this is always true, but especially true for AI. And that includes tax incentives, that includes thinking about community incentives. So it's not just money, right? It's about what incentivizes a community to adopt something like AI. And that's not always about jobs, it's certainly about jobs, but it's not just about jobs. Making sure that the policy incentives are right. Policy should also provide clarity to enable more public-private partnerships. Absolutely crucial. Go beyond education and tech policy to broader economic policy. I thought that point was really important. Also parts or infrastructure. I just used P to make the alliteration happen. So this infrastructure augmentation is badly needed. We don't have the chips or the workers. That seemed really crucial, that point. And I think I want to underscore that. That needs to happen before we can roll out the money that's been set aside for this. So thinking about how can policy enable that, maybe there needs to be more policy behind it. Maybe there needs to be more citizen or community engagement to make that happen. And also, many companies are behind on implementation. So even getting the chips, even getting what we need infrastructure-wise, the companies aren't quite there. So how companies like Accenture can work with state and local governments to get the companies there, maybe that's part of it, right? Getting the small and mid-sized companies to get to that place. And of course, and that's workers. So people need to be first, otherwise none of this works. None of this works without the people. And I do think that we forget that. Here in the public policy school, I can tell you that there's a lot of discussion about policy and big ideas, and that's very important. But all of it comes down to a person. And that's very true about technology, right? We have one course on human-centered design. And it's important to think about that that's one course. And everything that we're doing and everything that you're doing should be about the person. And when you bring it down to a person, it really changes everything. It changes the way you think about it. So we need to be thinking about reskilling, maybe in areas like data fundamentals. This came out in your study, and I think that's an important point. Data fundamentals should be a part of any kind of reskilling. Equitable pay, that's actually easy, and yet it's still not a part of a lot of AI policy or packages that I've seen. Worker protections, and this broader awareness of issues like transportation and childcare, making those a part of workers' rights, worker bills, making that a part of AI. So it's not a separate thing. That becomes woven into the fabric of a community. And finally, I think I want to underscore the fact that there is a really critical role for academia to play in these discussions. Academia should serve as this kind of neutral space. I think of it as this third space that operates between the private sector and government, especially now when tech policy is really not moving, right? And here you have the private sector innovating, and you have a lot of difference between the big tech companies and the small tech companies. Academia can serve as this space for innovation. It's a powerful driver of tech and policy innovation. We leverage our unique strengths in research, interdisciplinary collaboration, and long-term thinking. The Tech and Public Policy Program, for example, is working on a project with banks and our Data Science for Public Policy program to build financial compliance AI models. Excuse me. And so that's an area of great uncertainty for financial institutions, but we have the ability and the infrastructure and the creativity to help them build those models and the interest, right? So this is just something to underscore for you all. So thanks again for joining us. We have some more closing remarks, but I just want to say thanks again, and please do join us on the 9th floor for the reception afterwards.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eyal Darman. I'm standing between you and that reception, so we're going to try to make this quick, short, and sweet. We had two great panels today, so I wanted to first thank all the panelists that participated in both panels. Thank you. I think it was an interesting conversation between the economic impacts of this technology and the economic opportunity of it. If you remember, Stephen this morning talked about that there's a 7% increase in GDP that will come out of this technology. So noticeable impact to our economy. And then in our last panel, we talked about the workforce. And how does that workforce really adjust, change, adapt to this new capability? Let me give you a couple examples of what we've seen at Accenture with some of our clients. And I'll give you some real practical examples of thinking big, but starting really small. Our first example is in New Mexico. We have a health and human services client that's using generative AI to improve how they provide services to residents. They've been able to turn on contact center generative AI solutions in order to summarize a call at the end of the conversation, in order to help the agent provide better service, and the outcomes are a 10% reduction in the time it takes to service every resident. Now, that doesn't mean that 10% of the workforce is being lost in New Mexico in that contact center. It's actually the opposite, as was mentioned in our last panel. They're actually serving more people, they're looking to provide more services, and the outcomes of those conversations are better and richer interactions between residents and their government services. So that's one good example of how, in a small state, focused on one agency, how they're providing generative AI capabilities to their employees in order to provide better services to residents. Let's look at a big state. Let's look in California. In California, and we talked about language access and language translation capabilities, we're turning on language translation capabilities to provide and improve access to the 40 million people that live in the state of California. The Health and Human Services Agency in California is going to have the ability to use generative AI across every format and every medium in translating their content into over 100 languages. Today, they're required to do about 10 or 12. Think about how much better engagement they'll get when they're able to do it with over 100 different languages. That capability will just provide an improvement on the services that the Health and Human Service Agency in California provide to residents. You can pick the language, and you'll get a culturally adaptive translation. This isn't Google Translate. This is really a translation using generative AI to provide that capability. So small state, large state, and almost everything in between, we're seeing that. Now, we talked about education. Michelle mentioned about that maybe three-legged stool between government, the private sector, and academia. I'll give you an example in Massachusetts. The state of Massachusetts, or the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, rather, has a program that combines Northeastern students and soon other Massachusetts-based colleges and universities to have their students participate in the development of AI solutions for state government, and the private sector, in this case Accenture, is the third part of that, providing coaching, guidance, being a call-a-friend model when someone gets stuck on something. This past round, they've implemented 6 different AI solutions for state government agencies. Internally, the Commonwealth Department of Technology has identified and prioritized dozens of use cases. In the first round, they did 6. Every one of those 6 is going to go into a production environment and be used by those state agencies. A majority of that work was developed by students at Northeastern. And the expectation is not just that those Northeastern students will do future use cases, but rather new employment opportunities for those students have arisen. A portion of them, over half of them, have actually decided to become government employees once they're done with their sessions. After their co-op, they've accepted offers from the Commonwealth to become state employees, something that state government was hoping for and then materialized as part of this program. And their expectation is in the next rounds with more universities, this will become an opportunity to feed people through the cycle and provide them with public sector employment, but also provide them with real life skills in order to implement. Our last panel talked about how do you get these skills into people's hands. That's a fantastic example of how to get those skills in practical use cases in people's hands, and then be able to apply them either for future use cases in government or in other opportunities that they have. And so my takeaway from our conversation today, which was very enlightening about what are different perspectives that we hear, what are our expectations of the future, is that AI is a tsunami. It's not going to go anywhere, but rather it's going to come right through us. And we have an opportunity to harness it to the direction that we want to take it to. Other countries around the world are doing the exact same thing we're doing here in the US. And we have an opportunity, because of the size of our economy, because of the size of our workforce, to help direct and shape it to have a positive impact, to achieve that 7% GDP impact that it's expected to provide, to really end up materializing that as we look ahead. So with that, I wanted to thank you again for participating and spending time with us today, and I hope everyone will see you at the reception.